All right, we're back, and we're going to talk a little bit now about how older adults use more of their brains to solve problems. So, the first off, let's talk about why that matters. So, when you put an older person into a functional MRI to detect what parts of the brain are active during a task, maybe the problem is to solve math problems, or maybe the problem is to think of words that rhyme, or the problem is to read a sort of a description of two people who are having a disagreement, and you're supposed to come up with a resolution. It doesn't matter what the structure of the problem is. When you place an older person into a functional MRI and track what parts of their brain are being utilized to solve the problem, put a younger person into this MRI, give them the same problem, see what parts of the brain that they're utilizing, you'll see that the older person uses on average more areas of their brain when they're attempting to solve a problem than their younger counterpart does. So why does that happen? Well, it's possible that, over the course of the adult lifespan, as neurons have been have been pruned and things like that, there's more connections between the remaining neurons. And so when a thought occurs in one region of the brain, it's more likely to activate other areas of the brain just through normal spreading of activation. That's what we call it when we talk about one neuron kind of causing a neighboring neuron to react, right? And it's a way of compensating for the fact that we have fewer neurons available. It's sort of we just invoke more of what's left in our efforts to solve problems. Because there are fewer brain reserves available there. I talked in the last segment about how as we age and our cerebral cortex sort of atrophies, what's leaving, what we're getting rid of would be the reserved parts of the brain, the parts that there is no memory stored yet, and that those are the parts of the brain that are used for making associations and things like that. Well, as those things are sort of being pruned away, we have fewer of those areas, and so we have to invoke more of what is left of our brain to solve problems. And then, like I ended the last segment talking about loss of inhibitory mechanisms, being unable to really inhibit unrelated responses. So what we might be seeing with the more active brain in the adult is that they really are kind of being distracted while they're trying to solve the one problem. The other thoughts are popping into their head and they're having difficulty inhibiting that. And so they're displaying distractibility. So it's possible that, this overactivity of the brain is a function of, trying to marshal enough resources to actually solve the problem. Or it could be this last point that I made, which is that they're just being distracted, and that extra activity has nothing to do with the problem at hand. It's showing that they're thinking about something else at the same time. For older people, what we typically find is that, most of us can't multitask anyway. I mean, we think we can, but we think we're multitasking because we are pretty good at hopping back and forth between the two things that we're trying to do, or the three things that we're trying to do. In an older person, that hopping back and forth becomes just untenable. They really can't even pretend like they're multitasking. So I just want to make it really clear, none of us really effectively multitask unless the tasks are very different. A great example of a type of multitasking that is possible is to be, for example, reading your book. Let's say you're studying for class, and then in the background you're listening for the oven timer to beep to let you know that the cookies are done, right? Like, yeah, you can track the sound of a beep while reading. Yeah, you can do that. But can you read two things simultaneously? No. Can you read your textbook while actively listening to the dialogue that's on the TV or YouTube that you're watching? No, you can't. Can you listen to my lecture right now while also playing a verbally based game? No, you can't. You can't really do that. You have to hop back and forth, and you're going to miss part of both of them as you're hopping back and forth. But in an older person, that hopping back and forth becomes not only untenable, but really to a certain extent kind of painful for them. It feels like really effortful. And so they're like, you know what, I need to just focus on one thing. And that is one thing that I've noticed about my grading over the decades that I've been a teacher, is that I did used to be able to, sit with student papers on my lap and watch, a TV show. And I think I mostly graded during the commercials is what I honestly probably was doing. But now I fast forward through the commercials. And so that has made it so I can't grade while I'm watching TV anymore, because I don't think there's ever that downtime moment. I was under the impression I was grading while I was watching TV, but the truth was I probably really wasn't watching TV while I was grading. I was probably grading during commercials and never really felt like that. But now to even try and do it, it's like, it just makes me like tense and anxious. So I do much better if I just go ahead and turn everything off, spend, an hour doing my work, and then go relax for real. So, and that's what I'm doing after this. I don't know about you guys. So I've talked a little bit about how the hippocampus shrinks with age, and places where potentially memories could be stored shrink with age. So clearly we're going to be seeing some impacts on memory with age. So when we talk about memory, we have to talk about kind of two stages. Input of new information, right? So as new information comes into our brain, as we age, we may be getting less information brought into our brain. I mean, honestly, if you're not seeing as well, if you're not hearing as well, you're not smelling as well, right? You are not tasting as well. I mean, like all the senses except for touch have been shown to significantly deteriorate in older adulthood, like off a cliff deteriorate. So we can right off say probably less memory is even getting to working, less material is even getting into working memory. Just to start off with, less is being delivered. Most elderly people don't really notice that they're getting less information because, again, they've got a selective optimization with compensation, right? They've got all this past experience. They have lots of, they can use context to fill in the gaps. They basically know what's likely to happen, right? And so they don't notice that they aren't getting all the information. They're filling in anything that they did miss. And then when they make errors, they say, well, but that's what I saw. And the truth is, that's not what they saw. It's what they sort of filled in. I'll give you a really great example. I saw an older person who hit a pedestrian who was walking across the crosswalk. And the older person said, they came out of nowhere. I didn't see them at all. And of course, I just would like to argue that a person who's walking can't really come out of nowhere, obviously. I don't know exactly what the older person thought. Did they think the person had like dashed into the street, or I don't know what they were thinking. But in reality, what had happened is that this older person didn't realize that they had, extra blind spots in their vision now, that there are things that actually occlude the parts of their retina that didn't used to be occluded. But normally they can drive without problem because they can kind of fill in that gap. They're like, okay, I'm driving down a street. I have enough vision. I can see a car, or I can see, I can see most of the things that you normally see while you're driving down a street. But they maybe have driven past that crosswalk a million times in their lives and never had a pedestrian in it. And that was like not something they would fill in. So if the pedestrian was in their blind spot, their own personal eye spot, I'm not talking about being in that blind spot we all have in the back of the car when you're trying to back up or something. I'm talking about like in an older person, their visual, the details are deteriorated. If that pedestrian was in that area, they literally, the older person's like, but I saw everything at the crosswalk. There was nobody there, when clearly there was somebody there, obviously. So they don't notice the gaps in the information that's entering through their senses, but we do see them committing errors. And the reason why they so confidently can say there was no one there, I know I was looking, I know how to drive. They've got a lot of experience and a lot of context to help them to fill in that information. And so they don't have that sensation anything's wrong. The other place where memory can really be hindered is through interference. What we're talking about here is, distractions, like I've been talking about, not being able to inhibit other sounds that are coming in through the ears or other sights that are coming in through the eyes, just focus on what you're trying to focus on, that kind of interference. And then, competing information that seems equally relevant, and I'm having trouble deciding which is the one I should be paying attention to. Multiple voices, or multiple thoughts, or two different things I could be looking at, right? Either one might be important, but I'm only able to pay attention to one of them, right? So competing information can provide interference. It's most problematic when the competing information is in this, what we call the same modality as the information that the person's trying to process. So, for example, if you're testing an older person's memory for a list of words, and the list of words is being presented out loud. So, the researcher, let's say, is reading a list of words, and the older person's supposed to be listening. And let's say that there are two people holding a conversation, 10 feet away outside the laboratory door. So it's audible, but there's nothing you can really do about it. I'm trying to run a study in here, but whatever. The older person will have trouble in that, because that's the same modality. It's both hearing, it's both voices, it's both verbal material. It's not like a tune with no words versus, actual list of words. It's in the exact same modality. That's going to really interfere with what they're trying to pay attention to. So the more similar it is, the more distracting or competing that material might be. So we're seeing shortcomings with input. We're seeing shortcomings with, ability to pay attention to or decide what to pay attention to with certain information. And those things are going to really severely impact memory in the long run. So I mentioned working memory on the last slide. Working memory is whatever you're thinking about at the moment. Distractions in your environment are absolutely going to inhibit your ability to think about the one thing that you're trying to think about at the moment, because other things are attracting your attention. So your working memory is going to be less effective if there are distractions present. And, this is true for all of us all the time, but it becomes more problematic as we age. As we age, we're going to be able to hold fewer bits of information in our working memory. Typically, when we measure short-term memory store, it's going to be somewhere between about 5 and 9 individual bits of information that a person can hold in their short-term memory. With age, it's going to be closer to that 5. When you're young and you're really focused and you're well rested and like that, you're going to be closer to the 9. So with age, we're going to see people being able to hold less information in their working memory. Now, with long-term memory, one of the things we're going to notice is that for older people, recognition memory is hardly impacted at all. Recognition memory is when you are given a series of options and you can recognize the correct response. Or I show you your high school yearbook from 1948, and you can, now that you see the people's faces, it'll prompt you to remember their names, or you can remember them as a friend and some stories about them, right? Because once you've recognized them, all of a sudden you have all this information about them. Free recall is a lot harder for older people. So if I say, tell me about your best friend from high school, and the older person doesn't have cues really present, just their own memory, they may have difficulty remembering their name, or they might forget which class they shared with this person, or details like that. Those are a lot harder because those are free recall, and that really is diminished in old age. Emotionally salient information is better remembered than neutral information. So if it's really happy information or it's really sad information, something like that the person can really have tied something scary is a really good example of the kind of information that's better remembered, because with those emotions tied to the memory, they're much more retrievable. Neutral information, like what you had for dinner, or whether the sun was out that day or not, those kinds of details are less well remembered, right? Because those are just neutral and there's nothing really extra to hang on to. The final thing I wanted to mention is priming. And, this is important for all of us and all of our memories, no matter how old we are. Having proper cues really enhances our ability to retrieve information. And so with older people, I think, they oftentimes, as an older person, you've gone through this period of adulthood where your memory worked pretty well and you have responsibility and you were raising kids who have horrible memories. So you think, wow, my memory really is good. These guys can't remember anything. You really start to think, wow, I've got a good memory. And then as you age, you start to think, man, my memory is really starting to go. I can't remember things that I used to be able to remember. One of the things that people forget is that successful memory relies on proper cues. So if you're trying to remember somebody's name, you need to have enough detail to help you to remember what that name could be. Just the other day, my mom and I were having a conversation, and she was trying to remember the name of an actress. And she was giving me a whole bunch of, from my side, felt like very vague clues, because they were along the lines of, she's dark haired. She was married to that guy. God, I can't think of his name. She's giving me these kind of clues. I can't see what's in your head. You're going to have to give me more verbal description if you want me to help you out. We ultimately figured out she was talking about Demi Moore, but it was pretty funny because she wasn't giving me any cues, and I was supposed to, retrieve this person's name for her. Proper cues are really super important for all of our memories. And you probably know this from being students, right? Like some test questions are really good and they cue your memory to the point where it's almost seems like a gimme question. Like, this was really easy. I could have probably answered it before I took the class. It was so easy, but it might not have been that you already knew the information. It might have been that the question was so clear that it helped you really easily to retrieve that memory. And it doesn't matter where you acquired it. You definitely know it because this cue really helped you. Other times you've had questions that were vague and you couldn't answer it correctly. And it was probably the question's fault. It didn't give you enough cues. Now, the thing in the story that I just told about not being able to remember somebody's name, stereotype threat is real. This idea that, I'm getting older, my memory might be going. When I can't remember somebody's name, it really means something. This is really a true thing that older people go through. They honestly start to question, oh no, am I slipping? And so that stereotype threat, if you're sitting there thinking to yourself, oh, I can't think of somebody's name. Am I losing it? Well, I don't want my daughter to think I'm losing it. Oh no, now I really can't even think of it. Who was I even thinking about? You really start losing your train of thought, and it can undermine any adequate cues that might have been provided. So when we carry around this fear that with age, I am going to for sure lose my memory and I'm just waiting for it to happen, it may actually produce this kind of stereotype threat that can become that self-fulfilling prophecy where you actually end up performing more poorly because you're worried about performing poorly. What I always like to tell people is that when, you were 12 years old and you were forgetting everything, you did not care about it at all. You didn't think to yourself, oh no, I'm losing it. You thought your mom might've chided you and said, man, you'd forget your head if it wasn't nailed on or whatever. You didn't think anything about it, anything negative about yourself. And so I would just like to argue, we should probably be able to do that for ourselves even as we get older. And maybe we do start to forget things or need better cues to help us remember. It doesn't mean necessarily that we're making a slide into, not having any memory. It's probably just improper cues, relax. You probably know the information and like that. So let's go ahead and stop here. And that's a great segue into the role of health in cognition.